Chapter 5. In all the world there is no desolation more complete than the polar night. It is a return to the Ice Age. No warmth, no life, no movement. Only those who have experienced it can fully appreciate what it means to be without the sun day after day and week after week. Few men unaccustomed to it can fight off its effects altogether, and it has driven some men mad. By coincidence, the man who had once been a partner in the Endurance, M. Le Baron de Gerlache, had himself been beset in the Weddell Sea aboard a vessel called the Belgica in 1899. I'm sure that was pronounced incorrectly, but let's move on. With the coming of the night, the ship's crew became infected with a strange melancholy. As the weeks went by, this slowly deepened into depression and then despair. In time, they found it almost impossible to concentrate or even eat. In order to offset the terrifying symptoms of insanity they saw in themselves, they took to walking in a circle around the ship. The route came to be known as Madhouse Promenade. One man died of a heart ailment brought on partly by his unreasoning terror of the darkness. Another was seized with the idea that the rest of the crew intended to kill him, and whenever he slept he squeezed himself into a tiny recess of the ship. Still, another gave way to hysteria which left him temporarily deaf and dumb. But there was very little depression on board the Endurance. The coming of the polar night somehow drew the men closer together. When the Endurance sailed from England, there could hardly have been a more heterogeneous collection of individuals. They varied from Cambridge University dons to Yorkshire fishermen. But after 9 months of being together almost constantly and living and working in the same close quarters, the men had built up a backlog of shared experiences that offset the vast differences between them. During these 9 months, the men on board the Endurance had come to know one another very well indeed. And with few exceptions, they had come to like one another too. Nobody much thought of Blackborough as a stowaway anymore. The stocky, dark-haired young Welshman was a regular member of the crew now. Blackborough was an extremely quiet individual, but nonetheless quick-witted and well-liked, a cheerful, willing shipmate who helped Green in the galley. They all knew Bobby Clark, the biologist, to be a dour, hard-working, almost humorless Scot. But they knew also that he could be counted on to do his share and more whenever all hands were called to duty. He got excited only when the dredge he lowered through the ice each day fetched up a new species of creature for his collection of bottled specimens. The crew once tricked him into great excitement by placing some pieces of cooked spaghetti in one of his jars of formaldehyde. Clark kept his own counsel and never mentioned to a single man anything about his personal life. Tom Crean, tall, almost gaunt, was exactly what he appeared to be, a heavy-handed sailorman, forthright and tactless, who spoke with a sailorman's rough vocabulary. He was certainly not a very warm personality, but he knew the sea and he knew his job, and the others respected him for it. Shackleton was personally fond of Crean. He liked the big Irishman's willingness. Shackleton also put a high value on discipline, and Crean, after years in the Royal Navy, regarded an order as something to be obeyed without question, nor was Crean above giving Shackleton a bit of the old blarney occasionally. When it came to Charlie Green, the cook, there was a widespread feeling that he was a little crackers, or daft, because of his disorganized and seemingly scatterbrained mannerisms. They called him chef or cookie, or sometimes doughballs because of his high, squeaky voice, and because he had in fact lost a testicle in an accident. They poked fun at him on the surface, but underneath there was a fundamental respect, and a fondness too. Few men were more conscientious. While the others worked only 3 hours a day, Green was busy in the galley from early morning until long after supper at night. Green was occasionally the victim of the almost merciless ribbing that all ships' cooks everywhere are subjected to, but he had his jokes too. 2 or 3 times when some crewman's birthday was to be celebrated, he produced a cake for the occasion. One proved to be a blown-up toy balloon, which he had carefully frosted, and another was a block of wood, daintily covered with icing. Hudson, the navigator, was a peculiar sort. He meant well, all right, but he was just a little dull. He owed his nickname, Buddha, to a practical joke that he had fallen for once while the ship was at South Georgia. The men had convinced him that there was to be a costume party ashore, and any man who had seen South Georgia with his own eyes, its glaciers and rugged mountains, the stink of whale entrails rotting in the harbor, and who could believe it to be the scene of a costume party? But Hudson did. They got him to remove most of his clothing and they dressed him in a bedsheet. Then they tied a lid of a teapot on his head with pieces of ribbon running under his chin. Thus attired, he was rowed to shore, shivering in the icy blasts that howled down off the mountains. The party was held at the home of the whaling factory manager, but when Hudson walked in, he was most assuredly the only one in costume. In any practical joke such as this, the men knew that the one to look for was Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist. A slightly built little fellow in his early 20s, Hussey was universally liked for his unfailing good humor. He had a sharp, satiric tongue, but he could take a joke against himself without losing his good spirits. It was not always easy to get the best of Hussey in an exchange of wits, though. They liked him, too, because he played the zither banjo and was willing to strike up a tune whenever anybody wanted to sing. Hussey's name was corrupted into a variety of nicknames: Husbert, Husbird, and just plain Huss. A great many of the men looked on McElroy, one of the surgeons, as a man of the world. He was a handsome, aristocratic-looking individual, slightly older than most of the others, and they immensely enjoyed listening to his tales of past conquests. McElroy could be bittingly sarcastic, but the others admired him for it. It seemed to go along with his cosmopolitan nature, and there was never any malice in what he said. They called him Mick. George Marston, the expedition's artist, was a moody fellow, up one day and down the next. He was unique among them in that he worried outwardly about the future, whereas almost everybody else was confident that everything was going to be all right. But Marston, whenever he was feeling downcast, would brood over his wife and children at home. His attitude was not improved by Shackleton's obvious and increasing dislike for him. It was one of those inexplicable things. Perhaps Marston's uneasiness itself was at fault. Shackleton seemed to fear that this attitude would spread to other men, but apart from his changeable nature and the fact that he was not overly eager to turn out for work, Marston was well liked by most. Among the forecastle hands, the seamen and firemen, the only outstanding individual was John Vincent, a young, ambitious bully. He was quite short, but ruggedly built and much stronger than any of the other seamen, and he sought to use his superior strength to dominate his shipmates by intimidation. He insisted on being served first at mealtime so that he could pick the best portion, and when grog was issued, he always managed to get more than his share. The other seamen not only disliked him personally, they had very little respect for his abilities aboard the ship. Vincent had been in the Navy, but most of his experience at sea had been aboard trawlers in the North Sea. Unlike Howe, Bakewell, and MacLeod, who had served for years aboard square riggers, Vincent had no previous experience in sail. Nevertheless, he had his eye on the vacant post of boatswain, and he felt that the best way to get it was to demonstrate a capacity for tyranny. After a time, the forecastle hands got fed up, and Howe, a soft-spoken, agreeable, and extremely competent little chap, went to Shackleton and complained. Shackleton immediately sent for Vincent, though it is not known what Shackleton told him. Vincent's attitude was considerably less domineering after that. It was remarkable that there were not more cases of friction among the men, especially after the Antarctic night set in. The gathering darkness and the unpredictable weather limited their activities to an ever-constricting area around the ship. There was very little to occupy them, and they were in closer contact with one another than ever. But instead of giving on each other's nerves, the entire party seemed to become more close-knit. Early in the winter, George Marston and Frank Wilde decided to give each other haircuts. Before they were through, they had shaved off all their hair with the ship's barber clippers. The next evening, the fever had spread throughout the crew. Everyone, including Shackleton, had his hair trimmed down to the scalp. After that, there were many pranks. The following evening, Wilde appeared for supper with his face buried in the neck of his jersey, revealing only the top of his shaved head, on which Marston had painted what Greenstreet described as an imbecilic-looking Johnny. And the next night, Wuzzles, Worsley, was put on trial for robbing a Presbyterian church of a trouser button out of the offertory bag and having turned the same to base and ignoble use. The proceedings were long and disorderly. Wilde was the judge, James the prosecuting attorney, and Ord Lees the defense attorney. Greenstreet and McElroy gave testimony against the defendant, but when Worsley promised to buy the judge a drink after the trial, Wilde charged the jury to find the defendant innocent. Nevertheless, Worsley was found guilty on the first ballot. Besides these spontaneous affairs, there was a regular series of social occasions. Each Saturday night before the men turned in a ration of grog was issued to all hands, followed by the toast, "To our sweethearts and wives." Invariably, a chorus of voices added, "May they never meet." On Sunday evenings, the men listened to music from the hand-crank phonograph for an hour or two as they lay in their bunks and wrote up their diaries. But the playing of the phonograph was limited because of shortage of needles. 5,000 had been ordered in England, but Wilde, in sending off the requisition, had failed to specify the word gramophone. Only long after the ship sailed did Ordlees, the storekeeper, discover they had 5,000 extra sewing needles and only a small package of the phonograph variety. Then, once each month, all hands gathered in the Ritz, and Frank Hurley, the photographer, delivered a lantern chat, a slide illustrated lecture on the places he had visited: Australia, New Zealand, the Mawson Expedition. The favorite was one called Peeps in Java, which featured waving palm trees and native maidens. The Ritz on nights like these was a cozy place. It had been a cargo area just below the main deck and aft of the crew's quarters in the forecastle. Then the stores and men's traded places. The supplies were moved to the wardroom area in the deckhouse, and the men took over the hold. The area was about 35 feet long and 25 feet wide, and McNeish had erected partitions to form individual sleeping cubicles for the officers and scientists. In the center was a long table with a paraffin-burning lamp overhead. Here they ate their meals, wrote their diaries, played cards, and read. In one corner was a coal-burning stove which kept the temperature inside quite comfortable. The Endurance's thick sides were excellent insulation. Outside, however, the weather was getting steadily worse. Late in May, the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. During the first half of June, the average reading was negative 17 degrees, but the scene from the deck of the Endurance was often fantastically beautiful. In clear weather, if the moon was out, it swept in bold, high circles through the starlit skies for days on end, casting a soft, pale light over the floes. At other times, there were breathtaking displays of the Aurora Australis, the Antarctic equivalent of the Northern Lights. Incredible sunbursts of green and blue and silver shot up from the horizon into the blue-black sky, shimmering, iridescent colors that glinted off the rock-hard ice below. But apart from the increasing cold, the weather remained remarkably stable and free from gales. Toward the middle of June, at the blackest part of the winter, a chance boast by Frank Hurley that he had the fastest team resulted in a dog derby. Even at high noon when the race was run, it was so dark out that the spectators at this Antarctic sweepstakes couldn't see the far end of the racecourse. Wild's team won, but Hurley claimed that he was carrying more weight than Wild and demanded a rematch. He later won when Shackleton, who was riding as a passenger on Wild's sledge, slipped off going around a turn, and Wild was disqualified. The following night, cagey Dr. McElroy brought to light a pair of dice he happened to find among his things. He first shook with Greenstreet to see who would buy champagne when they got home. Greenstreet lost. By that time, several men had gathered around the table in the Ritz, and in subsequent rolls of the dice, an entire evening's entertainment was wagered. Wild got stuck for buying the dinner. McElroy himself lost the roll for the theater tickets. Hurley, the after-theater supper, and parsimonious Jock Wardy, the geologist, was committed to pay for the taxis home. They held a special celebration on Midwinter's Day, June 22nd. The Ritz was decked out with bunting and flags, and Hurley built a stage of sorts which was lighted by a row of acetylene gas footlights. Everyone gathered for the festivities at 8 p.m. Shackleton, as chairman, introduced the participants. Ord Lees, the storekeeper, was dressed as a Methodist minister, the Reverend Bubbling Love, and he exhorted his listeners against the wages of sin. James, as Herr Professor von Schopenbaum, delivered a lengthy lecture on the calorie. Macklin recited a tropical verse he had written about Captain Eno, the effervescent seafarer who could have been no one but the effervescent Worsley. Greenstreet described the evening in his diary. I think I laughed most over Kerr, who dressed up as a tramp and sang Spagoni the Torreader. He started several keys too high, and notwithstanding the accompanist, Hussey, who was vainly whispering lower, lower, and playing in a much lower key, he kept going until he lost the tune altogether. When he came to the word Spagoni, he had forgotten the word, so came out with the Stubersky the Torreader, and had completely forgotten the chorus, so simply saying, he shall die, he shall die, he shall die. It was killing, and we laughed until the tears ran down our cheeks. McElroy dressed up as a Spanish girl, and a very wicked-looking one at that, with very low evening dress and slit skirt showing a bare leg above her stocking tops, gave the dance Espagnol. Marston sang, Wild recited, The Wreck of the Hesperus. Hudson was a half-caste girl, Greenstreet was a red-nosed drunk, and Rickinson was a London streetwalker. The evening ended at midnight with a cold supper and a toast. Then everyone sang, God Save the King. And so the winter was half done.